Hello, and welcome to the Click and Obey podcast. We're going to do episode number 2 on our emergency preparedness series. Last time we brought you electricity. This time we are bringing you food. Parmesh, start us off with some thoughts, man. What are you doing for your own kind of preparedness on the food front?
What's up, Derek? One of the things we started talking about a little bit, but didn't get too far into because we wanted to save it for another podcast. With our electricity podcast was food. I think we touched on refrigeration, maybe for 10 seconds or something. But yeah, I wanted to talk about food because I think there's a lot of complexity that people don't necessarily think about up front when they're talking about preparing for food. And like one of the things that I had to think about during, the Great Texas Freeze, being with child, who is bottle fed, like pumped breast milk, was I had to really think about that breast milk, right? That's one of the first things where, it's an emergency if you don't have it. It requires freezer capability, which requires electricity, which is why I think it's such a good tie-in to our previous podcast. But that's kind of where my mind goes, is not necessarily just the baby, but like we started off the other podcast episode. It depends on the structure of your unit of people. So do you have elderly people? Do you have people with certain dietary restrictions for various reasons? Do you have younger people, babies? And then you kind of have to go from there. And it will tie back into electricity in some ways, ultimately, and also to water, which I think is a whole different episode. But those are a couple of things that are going on in my mind, is like, not just short-term, medium-term, long-term, what do you do? But what is your structure? Like, what is your unit structure of people?
Yeah, I think that's the first set of questions. Side note, I definitely want to clip out I really had to think about that breast milk comment you had. That was a great out of context line I should just pull from what you said. But anyway, yeah, with the food, I mean, definitely deciding how many people you need to feed for, how long you're going to feed for, right? Are we talking, kind of like in the last episode, are we talking about a day that you need to feed? Like, hey, electricity's out, it's cold, but I can make it. Is it a week? Is it like, holy shit, I got to survive for freaking years on this kind of thing, right? Determining your level of food, and then, like you said, the number of people, because you got to multiply. And then also always add extra onto that, because do you have friends and family? Presumably you do, right? So do you think, like, what happens if they fucked up and didn't think about this? Are you just going to say, hey man, I got to take care of mine, because presumably they are yours, right? So like, what are you going to do there, right? Because we had a friend who stayed with us during the storm, right? And it's like, we happen to have enough food for everybody, but I hadn't even thought about that initially, right? It's like, what do you do with your planning? And one of the things I would say, the first thing to do though is figure out, like, what's already in your diet rotation, right? Because if you already do things that last a long time as part of your diet rotation, you're well ahead of the curve. Because while I do love me some fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, etc., that's terrible for long-term storage. Now, if you're throwing some pastas in there, it's bad for your carbs, but like, it's going to last a lot longer. So I think that's another thing for people to think about, is what do you normally eat? Because if you don't eat it right now, don't assume you're just going to be able to handle it during an emergency situation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're going to mess with your gut biome. And that might be part of it. Like that might, I think for some people, like, I have a very tender system. And so I assume that if worse come to worse, like, there would be some period of adjustment for me. Now, I would not just have a mutually exclusive set of foods that I would start eating in case of emergency, but I know that that's kind of just a cost up front. I think that's a great point. And I think also the other point, which is different from our previous podcast about electricity, the dynamic is certainly different because of all the factors you just mentioned, is extended family or friends, people that are going to stay over. Like, it's much different from a food perspective than it is from electricity perspective. Like, sharing electricity, different game. But first I wanted to get back to one of the things that you mentioned, like the types of foods that let's say short term, let's say 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, we're talking about. Fruits are barely going to make that, right? Like, fruits are there for like a week. That's not a great food to have, to rely on in emergencies. You want to have stuff like canned canned fruits. If you're looking at 1 or 2 or 3 days, even frozen fruits that just thaw out over time. And I do have actually some of those myself. Um, and like you mentioned, you want to have other things that you potentially could be able to cook depending on your situation, like pasta, that might not be that great for you. Um, but you need, I think there you need to mix it up too. Like it can't just be whole wheat pasta, for example. They make pasta out of chickpeas, they make pasta out of spinach, they make pasta out of beans, like lentils. And I think, and they also make pasta out of rice, but I'm not going to use that example here for obvious reasons. We're talking
Yeah,
about carbs.
if they make pasta out of rice, just use the rice. I don't even understand that one.
Yeah,
I'm
just use
so
the rice.
dumb.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just doing it for texture. No, but I think those are actually the things. They're pretty cheap, but those are the things that I think you should stock up on. Actually, I think that's a great point. It's like stock up on those. Worst come worst, I think if you're really desperate, you can actually smash all that down. You can get spinach powder or bean powder or something like that. So it's not a complete waste. It's like something that you can actually reuse uh, fairly effectively. Uh, but that's what I would say about those two items that you brought up in specific. Like with fruits, it's like whew, you're on shaky ground with fruits, even though it's good for you. Um, and then same with vegetables. And so I would say canned, every food preparedness podcast probably starts with this, but canned fruits, canned vegetables. But I'd also say for the short term, frozen, let it thaw out. That's still good for a few days. Like you can keep it for a few days, especially if you have like an igloo or something, you can really stretch it out to like a week or so, um, just to slow defrost. And
The side benefit
like I
too,
said,
if you have the frozen stuff, you can also use that as part of your like kind of ice for the igloo situation.
oh
Because
yeah,
say that the power's gone out and you've got the heat, so you're defrosting, but maybe there's stuff you don't want to defrost, right? It's like, well, you
right.
throw that in the igloo with the frozen fruit, it acts as a natural ice.
Yeah, that's a great point. And also, if they're all around the same temperature and you throw them in the igloo, it's going to retain that temperature, especially if you fill the igloo up to the top. It's going to retain that temperature for a good amount of time. Any solid igloo should at least give you a shitty igloo, frankly, should at least give you 3 days. A solid igloo could give you up to a week, maybe even a little bit more. I don't know about the crazy ones like the Yetis or something like that. That might even be better. Um, but I do know that um, yeah, the fake ice thing is great. There's also snow. Like if you're in a situation like we mentioned where there's a lot of snow, you can use that as fill-in ice, and that could prolong those frozen fresh goods or whatever we want to call them. Um, so that
Yeah.
those are great in general. Like frozen food is a great invention, and I honestly tend to prefer it over the canned. Like the canned, I'm thinking more long term. The frozen, I'm thinking like short and medium term.
Yeah, and I think you have to with the frozen, right? Because like, okay,
Yeah.
so what's causing your food outage? Presumably there has been some kind of natural disaster, right? Well, what happens in a natural disaster? First two things to go are electricity and water. Like almost always, right? Inherently that's what happens. So if you've got frozen stuff, assume that your electricity is going to go out. So your freezer might last you 12 hours, maybe 24, depending on kind of your model, what the setup is, how often you open it, etc. But like you're probably not getting much more than a day. And then like you said, right, maybe you've got a nice Yeti that's got a great barrier and you can get a week out of it, like if you're really stretching it, but you're probably looking at a multi-day thing. So it's one of those. Frozen's also nice because I tend to rotate that into my diet more often, right? I make smoothies out of frozen fruit.
Right. Yeah.
So that's the easy one for me personally, right? Everybody's got their own different setup because maybe people use canned more than I do. I use canned green beans, but that's part of my daily rotation, but also because like, hey, that's vegetables if we needed it in an emergency situation, right? I got multiple days of green beans as my vegetable. So yeah, I definitely think that kind of canned and frozen thing for the multi-day and into the multi-week scenario is probably your best bet. Um, for multi-year, like if we're going to go from here, right? Because we're really talking about fruits and vegetables right now. Obviously, we got pastas, we got meats, we got other stuff to talk about, but the multi-year fruits and vegetables is. And conceptually, it's actually the easier one because if you could have your own plot of land where you're growing things, boom, you've already got that in hand. Good luck having that amount of land and having that kind of expertise is maybe strong because it depending on your situation, you can grow food much easier than in other scenarios. But it's like if you've got the time and effort you can put into growing food, you can grow a shit ton of food and trade it at the farmer's market But that's your multi-year approach, right? It's got to be on the vegetables and fruits scenario. For most normal people, if you don't have a big ass farm, right, you're not making your own meat. You're not raising cattle and butchering them. It's just not happening.
Right. Yeah. That's a really good point. You and that is actually something you can incorporate in your day-to-day life in a small way. Like you and I both know people that plant tomatoes or plant basil, a few small things like that, and that's how you get the expertise. That's all the expertise really you need to get just to get off the ground. Not to be prolific, but just to get off the ground, is to start with one or two small plants. Um,
Yeah,
but
and finding
yeah,
some
that
like-minded people who grow, like you said, right? Like if you've got tomatoes and they have basil, and somebody else has spinach, and somebody else has green beans, right? It's like presumably you can run to a farmer's market and kind of talk with people. It's like, hey, can we have kind of this barter system? If you're looking for things for your own, like edible situation, right? It's like, hey, that's a good place to trade and figure out who has what. So in emergency, don't just look at what you have on hand. Look at what knowledge you have as well, right? Because if you know three neighbors down the street has like this shitload of green beans and whatever, right? It's like, well, maybe put that at the back of your list as a priority because
right. Yeah.
you probably have some form of access to that, assuming you know the person well enough, right? Knowing that it exists is not the same as knowing the person, but that kind of thing also needs to be factored in here if you're thinking multi-day.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. But yeah, I think that's a great idea. Is like the idea that fruits and vegetables are a very different thing when you're talking short and medium term versus the longer term. It's a you have to think about growing in the long term, certainly. Which, since we're talking about long term and viability, I wanted to switch to a topic where you and I actually differ quite a bit because of our dietary preferences. So I eat mostly a plant-based diet. I don't eat meat. I don't eat much, if any, animal product. I think like honey and some other stuff. I have my own views on that, but I don't eat meat. But you do, and meat is a funny thing in the long term. Like in the short and the medium term, I think it kind of follows closely with what vegetables. What you can do with vegetables. It's like you can freeze them. They actually serve. They serve. It serves as ice, yeah, as well, like a freezing source, just like we said with the vegetables. But it doesn't last long, and in the long term, this is where I want to get your thoughts. Really, is like, what do you do in the long term? Are you looking for substitutes at that point? Are you looking for a way to barter? Like, what do you do in the long term?
Man, at that point, I think if you're looking short to medium term, and we're considering that as like a day or two and then a week, like it's just a get your ass by situation, right? It's like, yeah, I like steak, I like fish, I like, pretty much name a meat product, I will eat some form of it, right? But if I have to go a week without eating meat, I'll make it. I will very easily be able to make it, right? I can do me some pasta, I can do some other stuff. But like you said, so storing it in the freezer, having something, if you've got the situation where it's like your fridge can hold for a few days because maybe you got a backup generator, right? So you can kind of
Right.
run your fridge. Okay, cool. You can have even like a few days on hand of just, meat that you might always have available to you, right? Freezer's the best way, but refrigerators can work as well. I just go with like long term. I do not plan on any meat as out of hand, right? It's just I know people who have a farm and who have cattle and stuff like that, but they don't butcher it themselves. They're more of kind of like trade, like they get cattle in, they send cattle out. So I don't know that I would have any kind of butcher available on hand. I sure as hell don't have the land, nor do I really care to be the butcher myself. I mean, granted, if it's a holy shit situation, you'll see me be killing some deer. Like I will not have any like hesitation whatsoever, but I just don't, it's not something I have as easily accessible, right? I'd have to figure it all out. So I would just plan in the
Yeah.
long term, like meat's just off the menu for a little bit.
So you brought up an interesting point. I was wondering if you're going to go there. It's like hunting. Does hunting become an option? Are you hunting, in Austin? I guess it would be coyotes. Like I don't know.
Squirrels.
Yeah, squirrels. Like, but are you hunting? And if you're not, and you're saying, hey, I'm just gonna have to go without, and I'm gonna have to make my plan, without it. What do you do in terms of nutrition? Because, with any diet, the vegetarian diet, and I have a lot of experience, I think, in this. It can be very healthy. It can be very good. You can see a lot of kind of plant-based or vegetarian diets, like the Mediterranean diet, which is, has some meat in it, but overall is pretty plant-based. Very healthy diet. But you can't just like, there are tons of vegetarians and vegans that I know, and people that I hesitate to use the word vegan because it's got a connotation which I don't like, and I actually believe in. I think it's a negative one and it's deserved. But um, but anyways, those folks who don't eat meat on a daily basis, I know a lot of them that just, they're French fryitarians or ice creamitarians, and that can't be the long term answer. If if you're in this situation, you're like, hey, I have to forego meat for logistical reasons. Um, so that's where it gets really interesting. This is not quite food, but it is diet and it is related. And what do you do? Um, what do you do for things like vitamin B12,
Mm.
omega fats? Um, I'm trying to think of a couple other things. Iron, right? Uh, these three or four things that as a
Right.
vegetarian, there's good options for it. There's nutritional yeast that'll get you your vitamin B's. For the omega fats, anything algae or seaweed, awesome source. Um, that's what I eat on a daily basis. And uh, iron. There's five or six things you can pick for iron. Some
Yeah,
of the
spinach
greens
is
like the
good. Yeah.
spinach and collard greens. So you can solve it in these various ways. But when you're talking long term, like this might get difficult, right? You don't want to be eating um, only spinach as your only source, right? You might need some diversity in your food set. Um, how do you approach solving that? I mean, do you start by trying to get vitamins and like holding vitamins basically? Like,
I,
what is the solve there?
that's kind of the mid long term option that I would suggest, right? It's like say that you're like me, right? It's like I know people who hunt. I really haven't done it myself, right? But I know how to work a weapon if if shit hit the fan, like I can be fine with that, right? And then I don't have like some kind of deep freezer where I've got 300 days of steaks laying around, right? I don't have like half a butchered calf that's in my deep freeze. But I think like in the mid to long term, you could definitely go the multivitamin route, fish oil route, for example, and just kind of have that. Most multivitamins are going to last you about a year and a half, 2 years. Some can even last a little bit longer. I don't know that I would trust them for that much longer, but it's. I don't think it's bad for you. Like it's not going to like cause a whole lot of issues if they're kind of going stale and they've kind of lost a little bit of that. Basically the I don't want to call it the amino acid because that's not what it is, but it's like basically the charge, right? Right,
Yeah,
the ability to act essentially is what I'm getting at, right? So it's like I think that's your mid to long term, right? Where you're like, okay, I'm gonna have to go. I've gone through my meat supply, through my freezer. I've now got into the week or two situation where it's like, okay, I'm gonna have a little bit more greens. I'm gonna have a little bit more stuff. I'm gonna chip in a multivitamin, maybe an extra multivitamin more than I was already doing. And then I'm going to start figuring out, it's like, hey, is this going to be a long term solution? Which the answer is no, right? Because I don't make my own vitamins. So then it's,
right.
okay, am I going to need to hunt? Because also, if we get into the multi year solution, I'm going to have to have moved, right? Like, I'm going to have to pick my family up and
Yeah,
gone somewhere. Because we don't live in a place right now where I feel like I have enough land that, oh, I can just go out and hunt in the woods, right? Like, that's not a situation I live in. If it was, then sure, I can just do that and not be that big a deal. But since I don't, I think you just have to look at, okay, I have to move somewhere that does have that situation and then go piece it together from there.
right. Yeah. And in the meantime, I think you have to get real smart with your meals too, because
Mm-hmm.
you have to do stuff like you got to get by on a daily basis. You're probably doing a lot more physical labor, and
Mm-hmm.
food is so tied into all of this. Your brain activity, your body function. So you start having to do things like be real smart with your meals. So brown rice and beans will get you the complete, if you cook it right, the complete amino acid profile. So you got to start making meals like that, maybe adding a little bit of greens on the side. You have to start piecing together like consistent meal plans, and you have
Yeah.
to think about that while you're storing all your food because you need to have your brain and your body functioning in order to do everything that you just said, right? To move. Um, yeah, presumably moving might not be easy. I don't know what the status of the car is or anything like that, or society as a whole in that situation.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, canned
so,
ham is another great thing here, right? Like canned ham has a pretty long shelf
oh
life.
yeah, that's
And
right.
so like beans and canned ham, assuming that you've got some kind of way of like crock potting or just even just cooking beans like however you've got access to it, right? Like
Oh, yeah.
that's going to be not too bad. Like you said, you can add the brown rice in there and you've got a pretty good set of the spectrum for your protein, B12, etc. needs.
So on that topic, cooking, 'cause I knew we were going to get there. which is why I was going with the rice and the beans because you can't eat it raw. Um, well, some of these things we were talking about, actually, they would cook really easily over a fire if say, electricity didn't work out. But the materials for fire, depending on where you are, if you're in New York, I don't know where you're getting those materials necessarily. Now, we're in Texas. Maybe it's a friendlier place to get these materials. I'm not exactly sure, but you need a way to kindle the fire, and you need something to kindle the fire on. Um, and so, what are your thoughts on that? Like, I feel like that is a vital thing. Like, if you don't have electricity, or your electricity capacity is kind of limited, well, you need a backup to the electricity at the very least. You need to be able to start a fire. And so, yeah, what are your thoughts on that? Like, what what could we do
I
to
think that's a big
mitigate that?
thing, right? So it's like, because even when we talk about electricity, that may or may not get you there as far as what you need, right? If you got a gas stove, you're not doing shit with electricity. Like, I care less if you don't have natural gas, right? It doesn't matter how much electricity you're running. So it's kind of that like catch 22, right? If you're using gas for a stove and then electricity for the oven, it's like, oh, great, but I've got one thing going at least at all times, but only one thing. Um, but yeah, I mean, to your point, right? If you can mitigate it such that you know that, hey, I've got electricity because I've got, a backup generator and I've got solar panels and blah, blah, blah. Go back to our previous episode on electricity to hear more about how you would keep this stuff running, right? Then you're in pretty good shape because you can almost always have some kind of fire, right? At least on the stove side. Other than that, the question is, do you have a grill, right? Because like that's your best way. You have a propane tank, you're accessible. If you have natural gas, the likelihood natural gas goes out with electricity is a fairly slim one, right? Just the way the pipes and everything's laid out, you're more likely to lose electricity. So you should at least have a stove. If you're like in Texas, and a lot of us kind of have, the natural gas stove because we use natural gas for heating. For example, the fireplace, right? If you've got a natural gas fireplace, or if you've got a wood burning fireplace, right? Because you talked about how accessible is wood. In New York, it's probably not that accessible. Though I would say, if you have an axe and a will, you can make a fire. Like, this is not it's not the most complicated thing in the world to do it. People have been doing it for decades. Um, but yeah, I think those have got to be the first things you're looking at, right? Is because, like you said, all right, you got all your food, great. Now you want to cook it. Shit, like how do I do that? And it's definitely like
Right, yeah.
either making sure you have electricity, or natural gas, or some form like of movable situation, right? Like a grill, propane tank, etc.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, that it varies, right? Like a grill, awesome situation to have if you're in the short to medium term. Again, the limiting factor there is what you just brought up, which is the propane. It's
Right.
like, how do I get propane? Um, Starting a fire, I feel like it's kind of a necessity. It's almost like we were talking about with growing food. At some point, it's like, oh, you got to think about growing food. Well, at some point, you got to think about how starting fires. We've been doing that a long time, so there is that. It's kind of in our blood.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that is an
having
advantage.
matches on hand helps too, right? Like matches are easy to store.
Yep.
You can get 100 matches, light 100 fires pretty easily, right? And it just costs you like 35 cents at any supermarket.
Yep, and yeah, lighters too.
Yeah.
Actually, very very easy to store. The liquid lasts a long time. Um, yeah, so you should stack up on both of those. Frankly, like that's always a good thing to have. And I think you're right. If you have an axe, you have a will. There's plenty of tools you can use. Um, you can find wood. It's not too hard. You can get sticks. If you have to go that route, get a ton of sticks.
Hmm.
Um, so I don't think it's particularly difficult. It's just a little bit. That's the thing that really hits you. Like when you're making a fire out of necessity, that's when you feel like holy shit, things have gone to shit.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely in the holy shit, what's happened here kind of
Yeah,
realm, right? It's, you
yeah,
know, I guess in theory you could get there if it's a week and say you're in the freezing cold and like, oh man, I've got to start a fire because I need a fireplace and whatever. Yeah, that could happen too. Um, if you are in the South, that is much less likely, and
yeah.
that's where we're at. So that's more of our perspectives are from there. We're not usually prepared for super freezing environments, as most people might have been
Yep,
able to tell
yep,
back in February. But yeah, that's a big one is how do you cook? And then with that same thing, right? Do you have water? Because if you're going to do beans and rice, you're going to need water. Otherwise, I give a shit how much electricity you have.
yeah. That's a great point. And there is I think there's a whole episode to be had about water. But that is a great point. It's like, okay, well, if you're going to cook, you can't just cook stuff dry, right? like if you have raw beans, or if you have, if you have canned beans, you have water within the cans. You have stuff that the beans are actually stored in. But presumably, if you have rice or any of these grains that we just talked about, whether it's like the spinach pasta or anything like that, you need to have water to cook it, and so you have to think about that as well. So yeah, you need water, fire, earth, wind. Is that where we're kind of arriving?
Are you singing a song to me? Like, what's happening
I
here?
don't know.
What have we done?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But that's what I'm coming to in my head is you need those elements.
Yeah, and water. I mean, that's like we said. It's going to be a totally separate episode, right? Because there's a ton to know about water. When I started deep diving, like how to have water on hand, it's like holy shit. That's when we actually thought about these videos because I was like, this is like several hours of me looking up like what's the best way and what's the best product and what's this, and so it's like we'll try to condense it down to some 45-minute video. But water by itself, like we're just going to assume for the sake of reason here that you have some or have access to some in some capacity, or that you manage to not have food that needs water. Which how you did that, I don't know, I don't understand, but sure, you got it right. But
Yeah.
I think that's the main thing with the food is like, okay, so you've got, assuming you don't have canned everything, and even if you do have canned everything, you probably got to cook some of it, right? Canned fruit will last, canned ham you can eat, sure, but like green beans, you can eat them raw, but at some point you're going to want to eat like you did normally again, right? So
Yeah.
you're going to want to cook them. Man, I'm trying to think, what else have we got to cover on this one? Because we've kind of given the short, mid, long term, and then we've got that, hey, you got to remember you got to be able to cook this shit after you get out of it.
Yeah. Well, actually, I thought there was one more part to the cooking, which is the materials for the cooking. So let's say you have the fire,
right.
you have the goods to actually cook. Let's say rice and beans, and you got enough water to do it. And let's say you have nutritional yeast to put on top of it, so you get a complete profile there of vitamins and everything. Now the problem is that you have silver. Not, I mean, I won't say silverware, but you have some cookingware of some sort that needs maintenance. You have to reuse it over and over and over again, and you don't want it to lose its effectiveness because your food is depending on how effective the thing is. So you have to maintain it. And I think in the short to medium term, not so bad. When you start getting to the long term, you're talking about cookingware and all that sort of stuff. It's like, man, if you are getting up and moving, you better try and find some water to move by. I think that's kind of the point that we're eventually going to get at. And I want to save the water thing for another episode, but like, I think if you're going to pick up and move, which might have to happen in the long term, you got to be by a body of water somehow, a stream, something like that.
Yeah, 100%, right? I mean, it's going to become so vital because not just even the water, there's water drinking, there's water usage for food, there's sanitation, there's all kinds of stuff that comes along with that, right? Because you brought up the cookware. It's like, okay, say that you have a pot, and the pot's fine because you can heat it up and you can like heat the shit out of it and clean it, right? Even if it looks pretty dirty, you kind of wipe it out with a rag, but it's not clean that we think of right in a dishwasher, but it's clean enough, right? It's not, no bacteria on it, it's been superheated. It's like, what are you eating with, right? Are you eating with forks and spoons, right? You might have plasticware. You might be trying to have kind of a spork metal thing and keeping that clean. So you're going to just be like reheating that every single time, right? Putting that over open flame and getting it super hot and then using it. It's like, these are all things you got to think about too. So I was glad you brought it up because I had forgotten. It's like, yeah, that's kind of very important, right? And some things you can just eat by hand, right? It is possible that you heat the shit out of something, you let it cool for a little bit, you reach in, you grab it. But a lot of things are much easier if you have silverware. And also, that's easy for us, right? Me and you can eat shit with our hand. It is what it is. But what if you got kids? You know, it's like, what do you got people with kind of like weak gums, weak teeth? Like, how are they going to do it, right? And that's also, I hadn't even thought about that before too, but it's like, how are you going to maintain your teeth? Because if you're going to be eating stuff, right, it's like, and that kind of goes into sanitation. That's, once again, another video in the future, right? But But presumably, if you get bad teeth, like, you're going to be shit out of luck here. So you got to think about that too. Are you going to have a ton of sugary, like all these fruits with fruit syrups that are just going to rot your teeth out, and in a year you're all going to be done and you can't eat anymore? Like, that's going to be a hindrance. You got to make sure what you're doing is balanced, and make sure if you have the sugary stuff, you can maintain yourself even with that.
Yeah, and I did want to add one more thing. Like, there's a couple things you could do. You know, mint is a good cleaner, natural cleaner, for the mouth and things like that. And that's a thing you can grow. It's not hard to grow, actually. It grows in a lot of different climates too. Um, it's a great beginner plan, actually, and that's something that people should probably consider. But I think the bigger thing that we haven't brought up yet, which is more on the drink side, is alcohol.
Mm.
Like you need alcohol, I think, if you're going to live in this world, especially like given COVID and all that. Like you need some sort of sanitation.
Oh, I was going
Um,
to say you need to be plastered, but sure, we can go with
okay,
sanitation too.
that's a sanitation of the soul. That works.
Oh, yes, I like it.
um, but now, me personally, I don't. But yeah, I also think it has the purpose of cleaning, like what we are just talking about. Like we live in a world where we might have to pay more attention to sanitization. Um, and I think it's important to have some type of rubbing alcohol or whatever type of alcohol you can get to to clean things up. I think that's important.
Yeah, 100%. All right, I'm trying to think. Do we have anything else to discuss? So just kind of a recap, right? It's like your short and long term. You're talking your fruits and vegetables. Cans are good for longer term. Short term, frozen because it can also be used as kind of ice to maintain things. Have yourself a cooler because that's going to be how you're going to maintain things, assuming electricity goes out. If you can manage to keep your electricity via backup generator or whatever, that's going to help you the most as far as like getting the cooking done, right? Because then you can kind of run things and manage it. Your meat, good luck to you. You probably can get like a week's worth, a couple weeks worth, but if you're like most people who don't have a deep freeze and a calf in it, like, you're probably not going anywhere with the meat, so be prepared with vitamins, things like that. Um, are we kind of missing anything? Because we talked about our meats, vegetables, fruits. Uh, you talked about beans and rice, right? Like that's a good one because that's going to store well. You can store a shit ton of it that'll last you a while, right? Assuming that you've got water and electricity to cook on, like you can live on beans and rice for forever, and also it's pretty cheap. That's the nice thing, right? And actually, maybe that's something else to talk about here is like with your storage profile, make sure like what do you have the means to do, right? As part of your rotation, if you're rotating in pastas, beans, and rice every once in a while, then you're normally or you're acclimated to it, right? So that's fine. You're not going to have a big
Yeah.
problem with your gut biome when you do it. But also, it's already there, right? So you'll say, oh, every 3 months we have beans and rice. So you already kind of have stuff stored off to the side, right? And this is more if you're looking short to medium term of how do you make sure you have stuff on hand. Well, if you normally have stuff on hand because you normally eat it, just keep an extra spare of it, right? It's like, oh, I have pasta. Well, maybe keep double angel hair and double thin spaghetti because, hey, that now gives you a buffer, right? So that's 2 days worth of food. And now you have beans and rice. So now that's a third day of food. It's like you can kind of build yourself in 7 days without really changing your rotation at all. Just figure out a system of which you know what the latest and greatest is you have. But you're going to rotate that out every 3 months anyway. So you're always going to stay on top of it without even really having
Yeah.
to do anything.
Yeah, that's a great point. I did want to point out one more thing. We briefly kind of talked about grains. So one of the things that will be very difficult um, in this type of world that we're describing, short, medium, long term, whatever, is actually like bread
Mm.
in general. Like you can't really make it without some first world amenities.
Yeah.
Unless you're able to get fashion an oven. It's like you can produce a very very hot fire. You can confine it, and you can fashion an oven, and you get your hands on like live yeast culture. I mean, it's just it. That's a that's like one of those artisanal artisanal. I don't know what you would call it, activities
Mm.
that has become like a part of our daily lives. You know,
Yeah,
uh,
as a
I
person who has a bread maker, right? It's like I'm trying to think of how I would even go about it. So I have all the things for bread, right? And in theory, I have probably enough of it to make 3 loaves of bread that'll all last you about 2 days, give or take. I mean, depending on how stale you're willing to have the bread, right? If you're willing to have it really stale, it'll last you longer. But it's like, yeah, you'd have to have water. You got to have electricity in order to do it, or some way of having a stove, right? Or not stove, but an oven to actually bake it. If we have a bread maker, so electricity would get us there. But yeah, it's like that's one of those. You could do it. I'm not sure that's what I would want on my plan for sure, right? Is like the bread because that's just so many more bang for your buck items with pastas. I would think, right? Where you're still going to get kind of your grains to fill your need on that one, but bread is so hard, especially because it goes bad really quickly.
Yeah, it does. And really, I think that's it. Other than like the only other thing I could possibly think of is like rationing might become a thing for you. And if that's the case, you really have to um, if you can find chewy, proteiny type of foods that you can kind of keep chewing on, or very fibrous foods, you can ration pretty well. Like you can get away with going longer amounts of time, maybe 2 or 3 more hours than you normally would between meals. Um, Things like that you'd have to think about.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting topic as well, right? Is like some of the things like sunflower seeds, stuff that'll kind of keep
Right there.
your chewing going, and so it'll kind of like what's the term? Satiate you. Term satiate is that it'll kind of keep you going for a while, right? So I think that makes a ton of sense to have something like that. Once again, sunflower seeds are like $1 for like the massive ass pack that could like
Yeah.
do a whole baseball team for for like a full game. So that's
Well,
easy.
actually, yeah, this is a great one. If you're going to stock stuff, well, I'm surprised we didn't bring this up earlier.
Oh,
Nuts,
seeds. Yeah, nuts and seeds,
nuts
right?
and seeds, um, butter, not butter, but like nut butter,
Right.
like peanut butter, cashew butter, whatever you can get your hands on, almond butter, sunflower seed butter. It's also very satiating. Those things are gold. Like you can get by on those, and
Yeah.
they've got a solid amount of protein. They've got good fats. You can cheat through meals using that. And on a related topic, stuff like Cliff Bars, which all have peanut butter or some of these items in there, also good. But again, those will run out in a long-term situation,
Yeah.
and you can't really make them too easily.
Yeah, I mean these are all small to medium term stuff, right? Where it's
Yeah,
like, hey, you got to go a week, and that's largely what most people are going to be set for, right? I mean, there's very few of us that are set for long term, quite honestly, and it's going to take you quite a bit of time. Like you're going to need more than this video to figure out how to go into like long term maintenance, right? Because
yeah,
even say you have your own garden and you're growing tomatoes and you got green beans, you got all this stuff, right? It's like, okay, great, you've got a third of what you need, and that's if you're really
right.
good and have that kind of land and can do that kind of growth. It's like if I mean if you're at 1/3 and if you're like an advanced, food long term person, it's like good luck to the rest of us. Like we're all pretty
Yeah,
fucked as far as long term.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like we just mentioned. It's like if you're thinking long term and things are really bad, like electricity's super sketchy, you've got a baby, something like that, some combination of things, like water is difficult to come by, you have to move, and you have to move near water.
Yeah, because that's also where the animals are, quite honestly too.
Yep, yep. And so that again, that's a whole different episode because you start running into some geopolitical mess when everyone's trying to get near the water.
Oh yeah,
This is
I
not
mean,
a this is not a new thing in human history.
yeah, it's like we are, and then too, it's like I feel very confident talking like small to medium term, especially as much as I've kind of like researched it recently and stuff like that. Once you get to long term, I've got some ideas and concepts, but holy shit, that would just be a totally different type of experience, and honestly, one I never hope to have. Like,
Yes,
it's
same
like
here.
I want to have some preparation for it, but my God, I hope I never end up in that
Yeah,
situation because
because I would even go as far to say this. I would say that if you're in that situation, A, you're not alone. So enough people are going to be in that situation. Presumably, if you're in the long-term situation, you can't get to a family member in Idaho or something and live with them for a little while. Um, like it's that bad, right? And so in that situation, uh, if you're moving, I would have to say that a prerequisite to that would probably be have to be acquiring weapons.
weapons, pharmaceuticals, like you're gonna have to be.
Yeah,
It's like as much as people can be anti-gun, anti-whatever. Right now, it's like yeah, if shit hit the fan, we'll see how long you go anti-gun. Like it
yeah,
just wouldn't happen. There are not any
yeah.
anti-gun people in the apocalypse. I'll guarantee you that.
Oh, hell no. Hell no.
It's,
Not then.
it's
Yeah.
like not that I
Then,
expect that to happen, right? But there are sure as
yeah.
shit no anti-gun people then.
And like I said, I mean, this is not a new thing in human history at all. It's like, okay, shit hits the fan. We have to move. We have to get near the water so we can be near all the resources and everything. Well, everybody's thinking that. And when you get there and you're bringing all your stuff, you're bringing your nuts and your seeds and all this other stuff, what do you think is going to happen inevitably?
Yeah.
As much as you might wish otherwise, there's going to be cooperation. You're going to find people you can cooperate with, definitely. But what's going to happen eventually? There will be conflict. And so I think that's where the food long-term thing gets really tricky is it's like there's a different if you're actually in that situation, you're going to be in a different socio-political situation too.
Yeah, because you always have to remember, scared people are irrational people, and irrational people just make it really hard to deal
Yep.
with. And I don't even mean that it's irrational to be scared. I just mean you will act irrationally when you're scared, right? Because
Yeah.
it might be
Yeah.
a rational take to be scared, but most people's decision making at that point becomes very irrational. So just like being prepared for that of, oh, you found food. Well, who all's coming? And like you said, there's going to be cooperation, right? Not everybody's going to be an asshole in the apocalypse, because also people are going to be like, hey man, do you have access to this? I have access to this. Let's do some bartering. Let's trade. Let's work together, right? It's easier to manage if we have multiple people on a farm, right? You don't usually have one farmer. You got the family doing it, but oh my god, yeah, we could go on and on about that because that is a long ass episode of like what the hell that would even mean. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a very unlikely event given today, right? Because we wouldn't lose technology in the event of an apocalypse. We would just potentially lose a lot of people and land and whatever. But it's a very interesting thing to think about.
Yeah. I almost feel like there's a Mad Max episode to have to be had.
Oh, that probably comes after the emergency preparedness, right? Just to bullshit, if nothing else, just to like think like, how the fuck would you even go? Like, what is your first step even into this reality, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Just a pure like bullshit episode. That would be a fun one. But yeah, I think we leave it at that. I think we covered it as far as we could realistically cover it.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, so I think that wraps it up for this. I mean, if you're watching this on YouTube library, that's where we're at right now. Definitely share, propagate this as much as possible. We're going to try to definitely go through more of these emergency preparedness episodes and then start going back into the kind of more topical events. We wanted some more long-term stuff on the channel initially because one, this is an interesting topic for us, right? We've been having to research this a lot since the February freeze, so now it's
Yep.
kind of going from there.
Yeah, and I think we're gonna do more of this. We hinted at it a little bit. We had some one-off podcasts where I think I did a 15-minute one, Derek did a 15-minute one. Those were not necessarily um, quite the same as our topical podcast. So I think kind of be on the lookout for that. Like we're going to look to mix it up in terms of having the day-to-day, you know, topical relevant type of podcast material and the more time friendly podcast material, like something you could watch a year from now and the context doesn't change very much. So definitely be on the lookout for that. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed listening. Share us with your friends and stay safe.
Peace.
Peace.